political science, and is a known Brazilianist. So, and without further ado, I'll pass it on to Barry.
Thank you. Well, this probably is the end of my 30 minutes of fame. I mean, I've done a lot in the whole impeachment process, some newspaper articles, interviews, and this is probably the very last. So it lasted actually 6 weeks, which I guess I'm pleased at. But, well, so let me talk about I'll talk a little bit and then open it up. But, I want to talk a little about long-term causes and medium-term aspects of this, what I would still call a crisis. So, you know, some of you know that I have worked a lot on institutions of Brazilian politics, and I have what's called an institutionalist perspective. And in fact, I wrote, the notes I have are from an article I wrote from the Folha de São Paulo, kind of reevaluating this perspective. I guess it's 15 years later. At least the major book came out in 2001. I'm still working in this area a little bit. And they wanted to see what I thought was right and wrong, pretty much, after all that happened. And the argument that I made then, and that I still think is important, it's kind of an underlying argument, is that Brazil's institutions are in some fundamental way kind of messed up. And messed up not in the sense that it was going to lead to a military coup and the country would collapse, but there would be a high likelihood of continual political crises and impasses. And what the argument I made then was that you had a combination of factors. One being open-list proportional representation, this electoral system where people go in and vote for individuals in a PR system, they vote for individuals in an unordered list. And that would inevitably lead to a very candidate-centered electoral system. And that would mean that it would be very difficult for party leaders to organize stable coalitions. And if they could organize, it would be at a high price in clientelism, in public works projects, and ultimately in corruption. So it was open-list PR, but in a particular environment of very large districts. Some of you know that, you know the Brazilian system. São Paulo was still the biggest, it was 70. And it should have even more, but it's limited to 70. And even Tocantins and places like that have 8. So these are really large districts, and that tends to make the ties between deputies and the constituents very weak. And that's true. It's even worse in a way at the state assembly level, where the state's the district, and everybody runs however they want, or whatever way you have picking up votes. And I have all kinds of discussions of this, chapters on this in the major book that I wrote. But so it's open-list PR with very large districts, and finally, the barriers to entry for parties are very low. And in fact, they've actually gotten worse in the last 15 years. So it's really easy to be a political party, and in fact, the Congress, at last count, I think, had 28 parties. Now, most of them or many of them, even most, are little parties that don't mean much, but all this raises the cost of coalition building. And so what I said was, a long time ago, is that it would be difficult for presidents to manage in this environment, to build coalitions, and they would constantly have to rebuild and rebuild coalitions. And so they would negotiate sometimes on policy, but not much. Mostly they negotiate by bringing people into the cabinet in exchange for control of, say, the public works ministry or the health ministry. So if you appoint someone from party X to be a minister of something, you're expecting that minister will bring the votes of that party on legislative issues, and in exchange, that minister has control of a policy area. So it's not about, as in Europe, it's about negotiating policy. Here it's about negotiating, fundamentally it's about negotiating public works and jobs. Okay? And jobs for the people linked to you and in your party. And you're constantly having to rebuild these things. So, now again, this doesn't mean I thought you'd have a military coup. It doesn't mean that it's, sometimes Brazilians thought that I was saying, well, American politics is better somehow than Brazilian politics. I never said that, and obviously no sane person would say that. Certainly this one. But then you had Lula, and Lula from 2002 to 2010 was a really successful president. And the PT was able to manage the whole business. And of course, the economy did really well through most of that period, thanks to China, basically, thanks to the commodities boom. So, but there was a lot of progress, substantial progress in the social sense. That is, the combination of Bolsa Familia and real increases in the minimum wage, sharp increases in the minimum wage, really took a lot of people out of poverty. So in this 8-year period, the country, all the social indicators of Brazil got substantially better. And this is a real achievement, and obviously incredibly significant achievement. In the first part, I guess really around the middle of Lula's first term, there was a scandal called the Mensalão. And the Mensalão was this monthly payment system that PT instituted to pay off deputies of other parties to vote with the PT. And this was a kind of sign to the PT, which was supposed to be the clean party, and run for office as the clean party. It was a party that didn't do pork barrel. And in the book I said, this won't last, because the PT is in the same system as everybody else, and as it spreads out in the whole country electorally, it's going to behave the same as any other party, because institutions matter. And so I predicted that PT would get involved in this level of corruption. And in fact, at one point during the Mensalão, someone said that in Brazil, among academics, they were saying that my Ibope, those of you who know Brazil know Ibope means your kind of Gallup poll rating, was rising along with the turma de pessimismo, which means the pessimist club, basically. Those of us thought things were going to go downhill. So because of the Mensalão, but on the other hand, other people were saying, well, the Mensalão proves that impunity is ending, that some of these people are going to go to jail. And actually, it took 13 years, but some of the people in that scandal around 2003 ended up in jail. So there was some evidence that at least it was getting tougher to be corrupt. And the PT survived that scandal. Lula got reelected, obviously. The economy was doing really well. Along comes 2010 and Dilma's election, and then things start to go downhill really quickly because the economy goes downhill at a sharp rate with the end of the commodities boom. So when I think about this argument that I made way back in the beginning, even before Lula was first elected, I want to kind of figure out what was right, what was wrong with it. And I think that there were some things I missed. One thing I missed is understanding something fundamental about Brazil. And in my view, the fundamental aspect of Brazilian social structure is that it's a society with a single cleavage. If you think about American politics, we've got social cleavages and racial cleavages and religious cleavages. The social cleavage, what we call the social cleavage in America is the evangelicals, social Christians. They don't have, in Brazil, that hasn't mattered yet. What matters fundamentally is social class. So, and of course, there are a lot of poor people. So when you have a society where the only significant political, I'm not saying other things don't matter, I'm saying politically, the only thing that really is clear is the social cleavage. That makes it very hard for right-wing parties. What are they going to do? When the mean income of the society and the median income of the society are really different. The median is way below the mean in Brazil because there are a bunch of really rich people. And in that situation, a majority of the country benefits from redistribution. So of course, Bolsa Familia was really popular, even among people who weren't getting it. They could see that it was helping the economy, it was helping people they knew. It was a popular program. But in that situation, what does the right wing do? There's not so much space for an ideological right when you have this enormous gap between the median and the mean, and you don't have things like race to exploit, and you don't have a social value, it's kind of an abortion, you don't have that kind of stuff to exploit. What do? So what the right does is live on clientelism. And historically, the right wing in Brazil has been really weak. It's weak first because the military took care of business, right? When you had a problem, the military was there. That's not true anymore, but it was true for a long time. And so you had this crutch you could lean on, was the military. You also have the foreign investment community. If the left screws up too much or goes too far left, investors will penalize the government. So as a consequence, the ideological right in Brazil has for a long time been quite weak. Now it's started to gain strength. That's quite clear, I think. But it was a right that survived on clientelism. And what that means is that you have what Tim Powers, a well-known Brazilian, some of you may know.
He'll be here next month.
Oh, is that right? That's right. What he and Cesar Zucco, a Brazilian political scientist, have called the direito envergonhado, direita envergonhada, which means the ashamed right. So when you do surveys of right-wing politicians, these people tend to put themselves to the left of where they really are. And they do it because they're kind of embarrassed to be really right-wing people. So you have this problem. So you have a left that's kind of, at least was ideological, and is kind of more left-centered now, and a right that's not really a policy-oriented right, but rather a kind of a clientelistic right. So when times are reasonably good, the left can govern, because the left has the support of its own people in a disciplined way, and it can buy off the right. And that's what Lula and Dilma at the beginning did. You can buy off the right with clientelism, they'll go along, and the left is disciplined. Now, if you have a right-wing government, you've got a much bigger problem, because the left will oppose in a disciplined way, and the right still has to be bought off. So my argument was that in normal times, in this situation, it'd be easier for the left to govern than the right. And of course, that isn't normal times when you have a deep recession, as they have now, it's a serious recession, and when you have a level of corruption that clearly had become enormous, right? And you have incompetence. And it's pretty clear that Dilma did not have the level of competence in political bargaining that Lula had. That, I have to say that I did a radio, some kind of radio broadcast, and with some people, a panel with some people in Brazil and some people in the United States, and I don't know who the woman was, but a woman in Brazil, a human rights person. When I said this, she said, you're kind of, well, she's a woman, so you're saying she's stubborn. And there's not a very good answer to that, but I'm telling you, she really is stubborn. And I mean, I didn't know how to respond without belittling this woman, but that's foolish. Everybody in Brazil understood that Dilma wasn't good at this. And the system requires a high level of skill in bargaining. And she took way too many ministerial positions for the PT. And so the allied parties were very resentful. And she just had a style of not being willing to compromise or negotiate. And it may have served her well in other environments. So she has a storied political history. But it doesn't work, especially when you have diminishing resources. So those things together obviously made it impossible, finally, for the left to survive. So that's the first thing that I think that I didn't understand in enough depth. The second thing I didn't understand, I mean, I knew this, but I didn't see its importance, was the significance of oligopoly, particularly in the construction sector in Brazil. If you follow this corruption scandal, you have these 8 or 10 enormous firms. Some of those people are in jail now, Odebrecht and Andrade Gutierrez, and these enormous construction companies that dominate they do a lot of they do a lot of subcontracting, but they're enormous big firms. And here's Petrobras, which is expanding very fast. It's one of the biggest companies in the world. They're a really they're not a monopsonist, but it's a really enormous company. You need to do business with them. And here you've got these. They're not a monopoly, but there's an oligopoly of these big construction companies. That's perfect. So they get together, you rig bids, the big construction companies pay off, the rig bids means you're deciding who gets the contract in advance, and they're going to pay more, right? They're going to get paid by the government more. You got to pay off officials to play this game, and you got to pay off politicians who know about it. Because clearly the politicians know what's going on, and so you got to bribe them, but the profits are so great that works. And I think until this oligopolistic construction sector, whether it's 10 firms or 15, you start to get smaller companies. If you think about American construction, you have huge things going up in Pittsburgh by companies that are in Pittsburgh and they're not anywhere else. We have we don't have anything like a construction sector at this level of oligopoly. We have Bechtel and Mars and Knudsen, but they work outside the United States, where these Brazilian companies are huge and powerful, and now they're linked to the political system. It is possible that if enough people go to jail, this system will start to break down. But the incentives for these companies to get involved in corruption are of course, enormous. And the third thing I missed, and this is where I'll finish, it seems right now, with Dilma's ouster and Temer's government, that you're having an increase in polarization in the country. Clearly at the level of, for example, the universities and schools, an enormous amount of tension between people on one side or the other. I mean, the level of anger and of mutual distrust is more than any of us have ever seen who observe the debate in this country. And clearly you have an increase in the strength of the beginnings of a kind of ideological right wing. But for this system to survive, it seems to me, what's missing is a center. And at first when I first started writing articles in the crisis, I hadn't thought that out. Well, what's not there is a programmatic center. And the PMDB is a party that, I forgot, Capello de Souza, Brazilian, important Brazilian political scientist, years ago called this an invertebrate center. And I think she's absolutely right. That's a great phrase, because it's a center without any program. It's a center that can go with Dilma, it can go with the right wing, it can go anywhere, because all it cares about, its members care about, is pork barrel and jobs. And until you have a center party with a centrist program, the system is inherently unstable. You have a left that's not going away, that's going to cleanse itself of some of the corruption of them. They will rise again, I think, inevitably. And the right's going to get stronger, but what the system needs to be a reasonably stable system is a center with something that looks like a centrist program, which means efficiency, preserving social programs, getting the government to work better. And so far I don't see any sign of that. Now maybe it's too soon to expect it, but I think that's what it seems to me that Brazil observers should look for, is whether there's any sign toward the next election of a center that looks like a center, and not just we want jobs, which is where they are now. Let me stop and open this thing up and hear your thoughts. I'm sure there are many.
Speaking as a non-specialist, as not an observer of Brazilian affairs, but I'll say paying attention, I thought several times as reading what's transpiring that all of this could make an awfully good footnote in Lundin's essay, the article, Perils of Presidentialism. You've described this in terms of kind of party structure. Is there some kind of constitutional structuralism behind all this as well? Or that is to say, it seems to me that had Dilma fallen in a vote of no confidence, the sense of crisis and angst would be much less. Would Brazil, in short, be better off as a parliamentary system rather than a presidential?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is one of those debates that goes on in Brazil. There was when was the plebiscite? 95? Two? Yeah. There was a plebiscite on this, and there was initially a lot of support, and there's a lot of support in the Constituent Assembly for parliamentarism. But you have a lot of politicians who think they might be president, and presidents are very powerful. And I think that's, in the end, that's why public opinion shifted away, because in fact, in the thing I wrote for the Folha, the last thing I said was that Brazil needs a conversation, a national conversation, but it has to be a conversation not dominated by people who already hold office. Because every time, if you look at the constitution, for example, of Colombia, their constitution of 91 maybe, was done by a constituent assembly that was not politicians, or not the incumbents. Brazil's constitution was written by the senators and deputies of the Congress of 1986. And they formed the constitution. So, of course, they thought about their own interests. That's a problem.
That raises the stakes for the presidency against a crisis like this all the more crisis-like.
That's right. I think that's right.
At the same time, if it would be non-presidentialist, Congress would reflect, it wouldn't be much change. So the same people and the corrupt, senators and congressmen would still be there and still be giving, so it would it really change?
I think because of the symbolism of the head of state, bringing down the head of state is regicide. Bringing down a prime minister is merely the change of yet another kaleidoscopic cabinet.
Still would be traumatic and all that. But let me say one thing that you said before, that you said the right is weak. You right? That
it's an ideological right.
Historically,
yeah.
Either that or it's really strong, that it knows on the right time how to move things and get the military to help them. And have, when they need, they know what to do. They might be stronger. Apparently weak, but really strong, in fact. Because in the right moments, they went there, like now, and say, stop, where are the boxes?
Well, I mean, clearly the ideological, what we think of as ideological conservatives were, in 1964, were very powerful. But I guess I would argue that, as I did, that it's really difficult in an environment where elections matter, and when you don't have other cleavages to manipulate, as you see in the United States today. Part of the Republicans' problem is that the religious cleavage is weakening. The evangelical movement is becoming more centrist, and demographic changes are making those cleavages in this country more difficult to manage. But Brazil, as I think, I don't think you're disagreeing that Brazil doesn't have other cleavages besides a social cleavage. And that permanently puts the right on the defensive. Obviously, if the left messes up really badly, and if the economy is really, corrupt, by messing up I mean corruption, the economy is really weak, then people in the middle can move to the right, as they do. You would think that's a very temporary kind of phenomenon. It's not like that's...
Or cyclic. It comes back.
Yes,
it
okay.
needs to happen, which is now...
Well, I don't know what needs to happen is, that's a phrase I don't think
For them, the whole 12 years of PITT, kind of, they came to a point, how can we stop this? Not only in their benefit necessarily, the benefit of the country. I think many of them think, it's like the PITT you said, Dilma is incompetent. So in a way, it's my own benefit, but it's also trying to benefit the whole, in their view, of course. Hard to say, but I think they're more stronger than it seems. That's just my point.
Barry, you had a lot to tell us about the institutional context within which all this played out, but you stopped short of the impeachment itself. And I was wondering if you would like to talk at all about how you see that process, what's your vision of what happened, how you feel about the outcome, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, yeah, it's true. I didn't actually talk about the current crisis as much. I mean, obviously the Brazilians are having this big debate. Is this a golpe or is this not a golpe, right? Is this a coup or is this not a coup? Legally, it's not a coup. Legally, it's legal. In a sense, you can say that. I think that it's very problematic when you have a substantial number of people in the legislature who themselves are under investigation for quite serious crimes, voting to get rid of the president. And clearly one of their motivations is the hope, and this may turn out to be true in the end. It's not clear yet, it's certainly not clear. But it may turn out to be true that the investigations of them will be in some sense derailed or slowed or ended because now that Dilma's out. If that happens, I think that is an incredibly damaging consequence for Brazilian democracy. I think that's just that. And it's true that the number of people in the legislature, on the committee, in the Câmara, I can't remember the numbers, but some half or 2/3 of the people on the committee voting to move the process forward were under investigation. Doesn't mean they're all guilty, but probably they are mostly guilty. but it doesn't mean they're all guilty. But certainly they are so much under suspicion that the legitimacy of the process, clearly that's part of the argument. I mean, I know the social science community in Brazil is very divided on this. There's an enormous amount of mutual hostility, and there's no bridging this gap. And I think in a way, the ultimate judgment will be, do these other investigations move forward? Because some people are actually in jail. Odebrecht is in jail. Some of these people are in jail. But these politicians have to go to jail for this, the ones who are guilty anyway, where there's reasonable suspicion, for this process not historically to be judged indeed as a coup. I think so maybe it's one of these things where you just can't determine what the ultimate legitimacy of this process is until we see what happens to all these legal processes that were going on against members of the legislature.
But they managed to change the discourse, and now it's going to be hard to move back to the people who were being investigated. This all created, everybody thought to Dilma and let her go and everything. And I was wondering if that was behind it as well. Not that Dilma wasn't having a problem, but a lot of people believe that was a means of stopping some of the investigation and just forgetting it.
The one thing that's encouraging in this whole crisis is that the Brazilian judiciary seems to have shown a lot of independence. And the investigators, you really apparently can't stop these people in Paraná, these investigators. And if that's the case, they're not going to let this dog escape. I mean, they're going to keep after these processes. And so it may be that whatever, I'm sure Temer would like to stop all investigations of his friends, and he has a lot of friends. But I doubt that he can do that. And that's very encouraging. And again, I think in the long run, that means it's a lot more difficult to steal than it used to be. That's pretty important. But the trouble is that we thought that after Collor was impeached, way back in the 90s, you would think that people would say, well, we're going to get caught. It's harder to do this. And yet, 20 years later, almost 20 years later, 15 years later, you had this new scandal. So there is something, that's why I think there's something structural about, especially the construction industry, that leads to this stuff. It's almost all involved in the construction industry in one form or another. Because that's where the money is. The government has the money and they want to build things. And so until that gets, either the process becomes incredibly transparent, so you can't rig bids, or the sector gets broken up, so they're all just minor players, that you have this demand for stealing. Scott.
First 2 seconds to go back to the presidential question, but just to, I don't want to do this, but a lot of the work after Lynn's has said it's kind of the totality of the package. So the electoral system stuff fits into this. And so if you look at Italy, for example, was very unstable in spite of parliamentary, so there's a whole lot larger debate about that. That's interesting. But for Barry, you're giving a lot of credit to the judiciary here, that they're the not corrupt wing. And I've heard you say this in other forums as well, that if the system is so imbued with money and so tied up in this political system, how is it that the judiciary is able to maintain that independence and pursue these kinds of continued processes and not get tainted in the same way? And, that's an important legacy, as you're saying. The hope is that they will continue that and people will realize that they're going to get caught. But that puts why aren't they caught up in the system?
I guess I don't have really an answer to that. And it seems to me that these investigators, when I say judicial system, I mean in a very broad sense. I mean all these investigative branches, the Ministerio Público, which is this independent branch of the executive, but one that the president can't control. I guess you could bribe them. They could get bribed to stop an investigation. But once these things are launched, there are people who are making careers. This one guy, Sergio Moro, who's a famous investigator. He's becoming, I'm sure his face is on the cover of Veja, his face is everywhere. I mean, he is developing a reputation. He may not be getting rich, but he may have a political career. He's certainly he's a famous person. And so his professional advancement depends upon keeping this thing going. I don't see how, if he pulls back, yeah, he may end up with a Swiss bank account, but his trajectory is dependent upon these investigations. That's true for a number of people. But we have the same thing. If you look at the United States, how many attorneys general in the United States have become governors? And they started by prosecuting some criminals. You know, I mean, Elliot Spitzer's probably a bad example. But that's really a pretty common track. I don't know if we have any American politics experts here to say how common, but that is a common track, as Attorney General to Governor. Do it? Okay, that's a whole one. That's interesting.
Going on to what Scott was saying, could it be that the judiciary is not so clean as it seems, at least the whole, splitting the judgment of Dilma, Fatia, and have, her not losing her political rights? Could it be that it's already a little bit of, foot on the door to get?
But see, that decision, this split vote that the Senate allowed Dilma to keep, she could run for office again.
Exactly.
But that's an issue for the Supreme Court. Right? But the people who are driving this are not the Supreme Court, but these guys like, say, these investigators. These are, you can think of these in many environments, these lower level whistleblowers. They're kind of like whistleblowers. And so they have nothing to do with this decision of the Senate. They're technocrats in the judicial system.
But at the end, it will go to the Supreme Court, where Lewandowski is the president, and he already opened a little door, a minor exit or escape route, maybe.
I think you're going to be in the Togachi Pesimismo as well.
I'm just thinking, possibility, because it's very unusual. It's clearly against the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, some of this we just can't. We can't know it. We're going to have to wait and see for a little while.
Just have the appearance of something weird. It's so clear. Everybody.
Way back in the corner.
Okay, sorry. I got a couple of questions. One is related to what you said about the need of a programmatic center. That kind of contradicts the old thesis, I think, is Valenzuela's explanation of the breakdown of the democratic regime in Chile, in which supposedly the rise of a programmatic center basically ended the capacity of the center to mediate between the two very strong poles. So it's like your hypothesis.
Well, let me interject immediately, because I think it's actually, I hadn't thought about it, I think it's very much like what Valenzuela was saying, because the argument in Chile was that, Valenzuela's argument in a narrow sense was that the Chileans made it really difficult to have pork barrel. That is, earlier on, way before Allende, they made it difficult to have earmarks, the American phrase, earmarks. And so deputies stopped having reasons to cooperate with each other. And so that, the center, some people in the center went left, some people went right. And it's very clear, we had a dissertation here before, I guess anyone but me was here, but there was a guy named Siddhartha Bhaskar, an Indian guy who worked on Chile, did a study of all the public opinion polls. And Chile has public opinion polls going back into the 50s that are pretty good. And you can see over time, people who think of themselves as being the center just move either left or right. And so you have a distribution that used to be like this, ends up being like this. And so, the left and the right, it's very difficult for the left and the right to cooperate. There's nobody to be a broker in the middle.
Okay, so my second question is related to this also. So what's the level of class mobilization behind this process? And also, what is the expectation? To what extent that can get even worse, assuming that there is a also a new economic policy that is supposed to be implemented. I mean, the government just announced it's going to privatize as much as they can, and that I assume that's going to create a lot of resistance. And also, before the impeachment, there was an important level of class mobilization of the business community too. So I don't know. My question is, like, how do you evaluate this beyond the existence of a political center and the possible solution to the corruption scandal?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I really don't know, but my speculation is that it'll depend really on whether social benefits are preserved. It seems to me if Bolsa Familia is preserved essentially as it is, and if the minimum wage, the real minimum wage doesn't fall, then for the poor, the 35%, let's say, or 30% poorest people in the country, they won't be negatively affected very sharply. Now, if those kinds of benefits are cut, and that's possible, then I think the mobilization along class lines will become much greater. Because certainly the left wants to be able to mobilize people, and I think it will not be difficult to do if there's substantial reduction in social benefit and increase in poverty. What we did see in the early parts of the movement, for example, during the Copa del Mundo, was a lot of kind of classe C people, which is kind of lower middle class people, who are really affected by bad public transportation, especially that, and bad schools and bad hospitals. But I think the biggest one was transportation. But that's always a problem. People spending a couple hours each way to get to work, another couple hours to get home. People are very angry about that. And then fares rose, and that was the trigger that was the instant trigger to those demonstrations. And that's not a movement of the really poor. The evidence we have was it's a movement of people in the kind of lower middle classes. And of course, those people can become they can become supporters of a right-wing government. But if those services don't improve, it would seem that support would be very fragile. I mean, those people are vulnerable to cuts in public services.
Yeah. What's next for Brazil in the next steps, and what we can learn from the last impeachment process of Moreira? Something, of that process, this process we can learn, or maybe the other impeachments are like a Lugo in Paraguay. So, how you see the next steps in the institutions and in the parties and the society? How's they going to?
Well, I think underlying what's going to happen in the next, let's say, to the next election is the fact that it seems to me there is no chance that there will be strong economic growth. That is, the economic crisis will ease, and they'll go back, they'll have some growth. But Brazil has essentially no chance of having the kind of growth either the Asian tigers had, or even the kind of growth they had around 2010 when the commodities moved. I don't think there's any prospect of that. And that's a very bad problem, because that's really how you lift people out of poverty in large numbers. But there's no expectation that I've read, no forecasts of a renewed commodities boom that would benefit Brazil to the degree of the previous one. And everyone says, every economist that I've read says, the thing about this country is that it's so inefficient economically that normal growth is going to be very small for the very low levels. And the PITT had a problem. The PITT's model was a basically distributivist model. It was, let's raise think about it's a consumerist model. Like, say, we're going to make the poor richer, and they're going to buy stuff, and that's all great. And that's right, and that works, but it works up to a point. And, this is economics 1. At some point, you got to have investment. And Brazil's investment levels traditionally been way too low. Well, how do you get that? How do you get more investment? You can go back to squeezing the poor, right? But that has a political cost that's very high. You can tax the rich. That has another political cost. You can try to become more efficient, and when people talk about the custo Brasil, the cost of Brazil, it's certainly the case that the waste, not just corruption, but just the slowness, the inability to get things to market sufficiently, that's a very high cost. But again, government has to spend some money to do that, and there has to be a kind of consensus on political and social bureaucratic reforms. It's hard to see, since no one's talking, the center party should be talking about that, but they don't have a program yet, and that's why I think that there's no chance really of that happening. You know, when I talk to Brazilian friends, or especially when visitors come here, right now I would take them over to Carnegie Mellon, take them up Forbes Avenue, and say, look at that building going up at business school that from one day to the next rises and just goes up. You know, it's an astonishing thing to see. You go to most Latin American countries, and certainly Brazil, you see a building, and 3 years later it still looks like a garage, right? And maybe then it starts falling apart. And they have to get over that. I mean, if you think back to the cleaning the bay, all this discussion of the Olympics, I remember that way back in the 80s, the World Bank gave the Brazilians, I think it was something like $500 million, which in those days was a lot of money to clean up the bay. And I read a report, discussion by a Brazilian water engineer, and he said there were 35 sewage treatment plants. This is the New York Times. 35 plants built with that money around the bay, clean sewage. Of those 35, 2 are still functioning. This is, you know, those who are Latin Americans or Latin Americans know this problem, you build something, and then there's somehow never a budget for keeping it running. And maybe I suspect the Chileans have solved this, right? But they're not really Latin Americans. I mean, they're in a different kind of climate. But certainly in Brazil, this problem really affects economic growth because there's just so much waste. And it's not stealing, it's just waste because people aren't building the building, even though you started them. I think that's an ongoing problem. And again, I think you need at the beginning, a kind of national conversation about how you deal with things like that. You have to somehow get over that.
I have a question regarding this topic. I'm not an expert in Brazil at all, but I was just wondering, based on what you were saying, has there been some efforts, or is there at all an office of the ombudsman in Brazil or an office of accountability that is overseeing all these sort of bureaucratic processes or procedures? And if so, what's going on? Or are they effective, or do we need more institutions to regulate these processes?
You know, what's clear is there are some very good institutions. The Auditor General, the Tribunal de Contas, they've actually done a lot but they've been doing, and they're getting better. I think there are more people who believe in the mission of these agencies, and that's why these things get revealed. They come to the light of day. So I think there is reason to believe that simple stealing is going to become so costly in the sense that you're likely to get put in jail that it will diminish. And so one aspect of Brazil's problem, of the governance problem, is that the aspect of stealing I think is a good chance it will get better. The simple inefficiencies of not getting things done. I mean, Brazil's not going to become Sweden, but it would hope to become Chile. That's a more reasonable goal, where things get done in a much more timely way. Things that you start get finished. That is harder to figure out, and I think there really isn't even an understanding of that. When I talk to Brazilians, they say, well, yeah, but there's lots of bribes paid in American construction projects too, and so they don't see the problem. And the scale, yeah, of course there are a few bribes paid, but the scale is totally different. And until there's an understanding of that, you can't think about solving it.
Great. I ask you to comment on the Temer government from two perspectives. One is somebody said something about the mobilization, and he's incredibly unpopular. And so how does that affect it? And two, from your point of view of the fact that the right doesn't have a program, he's obviously making huge political changes, and privatization is just one of those things. So I wonder if you would comment on that as a program, and then also how you think the society is going to react to this very dramatic change.
Well, I mean, privatizations, remember the earlier wave of privatizations, I mean, social scientists and economists thought there'd be tremendous political resistance, and in the end there wasn't, actually. That was true both in Latin America, even it was true in Africa, that there was all this fear that people would lose their jobs in vast numbers. That didn't happen, and there was certainly some corruption. I mean, Argentina probably even more than Brazil in the bidding for privatization, bidding for these companies. But I think the impacts, both positive in terms of economic growth, saving, boosting the economy, probably are a lot less than expectations, but also the costs are a lot less. And I'm not sure, I actually have not seen a list of what they intend to privatize, so that makes it hard for me to comment. I'm a little out of it that way. But the major stuff has already been privatized. What's left? What are they don't have any railroads. The airlines are all privatized. You know, a vast number of things were privatized a long time ago. So, you know, under Cardozo and even some under Lula. I mean, it's clearly important to have a reform of the pension system. I think could save a lot of money, because the pension system has all kinds of bizarrenesses. Something like the state of Illinois, you know, where it looks like that, and you can see what it leads to. So there certainly money can be saved, and I think that will tend not to be unpopular, depending on how it works out. But if the government is sophisticated enough, it can sell this as reducing payments to people who don't deserve them, which is a lot of that's right. I mean, a lot of that you would agree that people who are undeserving. But I think it's logical to think of this government as in a honeymoon period. And
20% approval, honeymoon,
but no, honeymoon in the legislature. No, not in the society. I'm not saying that. But in the legislature, there's a sense that if Pemmer goes, we all go among the people who support him. So he's got more legislative support today than he'll have, I would think, in 6 months. I think there's a... Remember that, and the early thing I suggested is that there's enormous disjuncture between legislators and citizens and people partly because of this bizarre electoral system, where there are very weak ties between people and their legislators. So there can be mass disaffection in society, but it's as a deputy, it's not my problem. It's not I can't exactly tell who my voters are, even unless they're friends and family. I mean, so that makes it possible to have a legislative honeymoon in the presence of mass disaffection in society. But obviously that can't last indefinitely. You wouldn't think it would last indefinitely.
For better or for worse, Brazil had a very important role in the politics in Latin America under Dilma. So now with this change, I mean, there is support. I mean, there is nothing really, nobody has really mentioned about the Temer government, except Mercosur is now under Venezuela. So I wonder, what do you think, what will be the role, if any, of Brazil in politics?
I mean, internationally?
Especially in South America. In the region, the Venezuela, yeah, I mean, considering that it had an important role in the region.
Honestly, I guess I don't really know. I mean, this is farther from my area where I know anything. I'd be happy to hear other people's points of view. I don't know. I know that Temer is starting a kind of charm offensive internationally, and his wife is a big part of that. I was really struck by stuff I saw. Otherwise intelligent people talking about his wife, who was 35 years younger and was wearing a dress designed by some, the most sexist kind of design. I was really shocked, actually, but the people that was talking about how wonderful it was, and compared to Dilma, things that are really kind of revolting, actually, on a personal level, because but clearly she is going to be used as part of this kind of sort of international charming they want to get into.
Bela Modesta e Dilma.
Say that again.
Bela Modesta e Dilma. That was her picture. Dressed in a very modest dress, and she was a stay-home woman.
But people talking about how Dilma used to wear things that looked like rugs. Really insulting, offensive things, really.
Well, she was wearing this white dress, and then
the Temer's wife.
Right.
Yeah.
And then some comments say like, her dress was symbolizing everything that Tamara is bringing to the country, a white.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's used on the list.
You know, one thing about white dresses is we all, and white shirts is they get dirty really quickly.
Some people have talked about the fatigue of democracy. And not only in Brazil, but Brazil being a real example of this, where people, and I'm thinking of people I know that supported the PT, they just feel so deceived with what they supported. And basically, nobody else has got, with so many people under investigation, there's no place else to turn that provides any inspiration. Do you see this as a major social type problem that would impact on people?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question, and obviously there's no obvious, we can't tell exactly, we don't know. But I think that there are, first thing, there are a lot of people in the PITT who are not corrupt, right, who did not steal, who believe in the social goals of the party, who are committed to, for example, to working with organizations in civil society. And Brazil has a very vibrant civil society. I mean, we haven't talked about that at all, but remember, this is, and compared to 20, 30 years ago, it's enormously different. That there's a really active Tocquevillian civil society in this country. And I think that supports people who, the PITT is going to survive. It's going to purge itself, I think, in some form. There are going to be people who themselves have no fiches, no files against them, no charges, and who are willing to who propose and adopt kind of codes of conduct and transparency with the support of organizations in civil society. So that may take a while. I doubt they will do well in the next election, but that gives them time to reconstruct the basics. Because remember, the party, when it was in the 90s and 80s in the south of Brazil, in fact, it merited the credit that it gets. I've never been a great fan of participatory budgeting, but for my own kind of reasons. I think it was, in fact, an effort to, it was a sincere effort to say, well, let's let people decide what they want to do with their money. You know, whether they want to have a soccer field or pave the street, they can decide that. And there was a lot of sincerity and commitment to that experiment. In a way, they need to go back to that root, that kind of grassroots quality. And that means getting rid of a lot of people. But those people, clearly there should be a lot of losses in the next election. And then the party begins to rebuild.
What do you think if Lula goes to jail? There may be some social convulsion. You know, Brazil is not violent historically, at least. But that could be something.
Yeah, I think that's. I would suggest that they leave Lula alone. But, you know, he doesn't seem to have huge Swiss bank accounts. Just, I think that's really. I think I don't know whether the president. I guess you would know. But does the president have pardoning powers? Jerry Ford lost an election because of this. Yeah.
And you mentioned Tamara giving Lula a pardon?
Well, I think it'd be very smart for Tamara to give Lula. Think about it.
It might be smart.
Politically incredibly creative.
But then you have to do Rena and Cunha and all the gang. I mean, why one?
Well, one's the president. Maybe you could do that as a gesture towards social peace. But if he hasn't got the legal power to do it, then it doesn't matter. That's something we should figure out. Yeah.
Should write it.
Other questions or thoughts?
I was wondering if the center is a bunch of invertebrates, as you suggested, why isn't and the right has a small space to operate in? Why aren't they moving over to the center and occupying more of the center-right position? Even, you know, during election periods, as we see other parties in other countries doing, moving to the center and then moving back to govern or something like that. Is that not happening?
Well, there is a center-right party. It's not just the PSDB, which had been running presidential candidates. Obviously, they ran ISU in the last election. And they also can fill this role if they portray themselves as a real center party. But to make the kind of movement you're talking about, I hate to argue with philosophers. I know I'm inclusive, but it seems to me that you have to have a set of issues on which both the parties and the population understands what the issue is, where you're moving back and forth. And if you don't have that, then how do you know what it means? Now, privatization, in the public opinion surveys that my group of researchers did, Andy Baker and Lucio Henner that we did over the years, we always asked about privatization because that was something that clearly differentiated people. Better than any, I don't know, was there any other issue that was clearly, that we really had separate positions and clear positions. So privatization, if depending on what's getting privatized, may in fact be something on which people can align and can move along in some clear way. Because if you talk, for example, about, well, what should the minimum wage level be in relation to inflation, that's a kind of technical question. It's hard to imagine a stable set of positions on where the minimum wage is.
Yeah.
It's actually really important for people.
Yeah, I can see your point. If there's only one cleavage, as you suggest, then it may be unclear what the center looks like, right? If that's a fairly deep cleavage and it's the only one, then where does the center operate? But that doesn't seem to me to be a problem with the center parties that exist. In that account, it's just the nature of politics in that country. Right?
And calling them center parties is a way of thinking already they have some kind of centrist quality. But actually, what if they're just a bunch of people who say, we'll go anywhere. Whoever's in power, we're going to align. Remember that Temer was vice president because Dilma Rousseff made a coalition with this party. Right. But the PMDB has been in other governments as well. They were in Cardozo's government. They've been in right-wing governments. And there have always been parties, the PFL was like this too, that they're simply governista, which means they're always with the government.
Just curiosity on my part, but you're describing the ideological weakness of the right. I'm just wondering how far back you trace that. Is that true of like the First Republic, late 19th century? Or is that something that's post-1960s?
What do you think?
Sure. That's a good question.
I have a hard time. I'd have to think more about it. I just can't give a sensible response.
I think there are two rights in Brazil, actually. There's divided rights. Like there's that Bolsonaro guy who's like, military and power, and there's the money right. And they're not necessarily the same.
No, what we see in these debates, in the impeachment debates in the legislature, was people clearly who are Bolsonaro being the worst, most gross example, people really ideologically hard right. And then, but we know there are lots of people, I knew a lot of these folks, who just want to, they're people who represent themselves in the legislature. We used to, none of you I guess remember this, but there used to be a senator from the state of Washington who was often called the senator from Boeing. This is Henry Jackson, was a distinguished senator in fact, but of course Boeing was the biggest employer pre-Microsoft in Washington, the state of Washington. But it wasn't as if he was personally stealing. It wasn't that he didn't own Boeing, right? He just represented the biggest company in the state. But in Brazil, we're talking in a lot of cases about deputies who represented their own family business, their own family interests. That's really different. And so that's what it's like, they're relatives sometimes. One relative runs the business, the other relative is in the legislature. Again, this is dying. This tendency this number of people like this is shrinking. But there's still a substantial number of people like that, and it's made possible by an electoral system with these very weak ties between legislators. And weak maybe is not the wrong word. They can be shaped in a multiplicity of ways. In Pittsburgh, Mike Coyne and Pittsburgh, right? And Paul Ryan has Southern Wisconsin. It's a geographical area. In Brazil, it can be an area, it can be an ethnic group, it can be your business interests, it can be whatever you can put together to build a coalition. I used to tell about a guy who was elected because he supported the monarchy. Nobody wants the monarchy in Brazil, but in São Paulo you could get enough votes to get elected. He also supported the death penalty. Now that's going to be more popular. But those two issues got him enough support to get elected. The Brazilians voted against the monarchy 85 to 15 in a plebiscite. You wouldn't think a guy would get elected, but in this system, this kind of multiplicity of bases works. But you also see the negative side of it.
I just wanted to ask a little more specifically. You already touched on this, but would you say that this whole process could potentially do good for the party system in general? If it's sort of, from one perspective, it could kind of clean up some of the ambiguity on party platforms from the perspective of the public, from the perspective of relationships among the parties. Is there a situation that this might be good for the party system in Brazil?
Well, you can think certainly of historical examples in other countries where a crisis led to changes in the party system that we think of as very positive for democracy. I would say that most of us, political scientists, would say that post Pinochet, the Chilean party system matured in a way that it became that everybody came to believe much more strongly in electoral democracy, and so the people who didn't got out of politics, and the center became much stronger, and that's been overall been a very good thing for Chile. So obviously the crisis of Pinochet, that whole period was awful, but what came out of it was a much more stable a political system that one can see being viable for a long time. Same thing could happen in Brazil, but clearly this crisis wasn't the crisis of getting rid of Dilma. Is nothing like the overthrow of Allende, of a kind of national trauma. That's the trouble. A lot of people are really happy that Dilma's gone, and that's a big problem. I mean, well, I shouldn't say it that way, because I don't think we have seen yet signs that this will lead to the kind of political reforms that I've suggested and the Brazilians have talked about a lot. And political reform is always on the table in Brazil. There are always proposals in Congress for changing the system in one way, or for reducing the number of parties, for mixed German-type systems. There are a lot of people, and a lot of people on the pro-impeachment side. In particular, Bolívar Lamounier, who's a well-known political scientist. He has always been on the side of a German-type system, a mixed system of representation. But I don't see discussion of that going on right now. So maybe there's just too many. The crisis is too big to slow down and talk about political institutional changes. I don't know. Maybe once everything in terms of investigations gets worked out, then they can come back to that.
What's the electoral threshold?
There is no threshold.
None at all.
Well, it doesn't mean anything. There's something, but basically there's no threshold. Right. Right. And in the late 90s, the Congress passed a law that provides subsidies to parties, so you have an incentive to form a new party. Because if one party splits into two, the politicians in both parties end up better off financially. It's stupid. And that led to increased number of parties in Congress.
Almost 30 parties, right? That's very...
Well, I think there were 28 the last time.
Almost.
Some of them just have a couple of members.
There is a Congress, not Congress, but a city council person who got elected with one vote.
To a city.
I read this 2 days, 3 days ago. Somewhere in the north of one city.
Well, in the National Congress, there have been people elected with less than 500 votes. Because in this system, if one person gets 1 million votes, that party then is entitled, let's say, to 3 seats, and it doesn't matter what the next 2 people get, they're elected. So you have people, one guy, what's the guy who ran for president, the little bald guy, the doctor who died? Ames.
Ames,
he got 1 million votes.
Yeah.
And he elected somebody with 492. And there have been other cases like that. Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Thank you very much, Barry.